On February 19, 1943, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel stood in the Tunisian desert and watched American soldiers run. From his vantage point, the battle unfolding at Kasserine Pass looked less like a contest between equal armies and more like a demonstration of experience against inexperience. His Afrika Korps had torn through American positions with alarming ease. German Panzer units advanced with precision and speed, slicing through defensive lines that collapsed almost as quickly as they were formed. Across the battlefield, the signs of defeat were everywhere. American tanks stood abandoned in the sand, their crews having fled under pressure. Artillery pieces were captured before they could fire more than a few rounds. Supply vehicles clogged narrow mountain roads, creating chaos as retreating units attempted to escape the advancing German forces. Entire formations disintegrated. Over the course of just a few days, more than 6,500 American soldiers became casualties, including thousands taken prisoner. For many German officers watching the battle, it confirmed what they had long believed. The United States Army, they thought, did not yet know how to fight a modern war. Rommel himself had spent years mastering the art of mobile warfare across North Africa. Against British forces, he had faced experienced commanders and hardened troops. But the Americans at Kasserine appeared different. Uncoordinated, poorly led, and unprepared for the speed and violence of mechanized combat. To him, the conclusion seemed obvious. This was an army still in the process of learning. Yet far from the deserts of Tunisia, a very different assessment would emerge. In the months and years that followed, German officers who encountered American forces again began to revise their opinions, sometimes dramatically. Among them was General Günther Blumentritt, a seasoned commander who had fought on multiple fronts. Reflecting on the war after its conclusion, he spoke with a tone that contrasted sharply with the confidence seen at Kasserine. He described General George S. Patton as one of the most aggressive and effective Allied commanders, a man whose speed and initiative rivaled and in some ways surpassed the traditional principles of European warfare. This shift, from dismissal to respect, did not happen gradually over decades. It happened in less than 2 years. The same army that had collapsed in confusion at Kasserine Pass would soon break through German lines in Normandy, race across France in a lightning advance, and stand firm against Hitler's final offensive in the Ardennes. German soldiers who once saw American troops as amateurs began using very different words to describe them. Not simply brave, not merely numerous, but overwhelming, unpredictable, relentless, and above all, terrifying in their firepower. The journey between those two moments, between contempt and fear, reveals one of the most remarkable military transformations of World War II. How did an army that seemed unprepared for modern combat become one of the most formidable forces on the battlefield? The answer lies not just in courage, but in something far more powerful: adaptation, leadership, industrial strength, and a system of warfare unlike anything Germany had faced before. Before the United States entered the Second World War, the German High Command held a relatively dismissive view of American military power. German intelligence reports in the late 1930s frequently ranked the US Army among the weaker land forces of the world. This assessment was not entirely unreasonable at the time. In 1939, the American Army was astonishingly small by global standards. It ranked 17th in the world in size, smaller than the militaries of countries such as Romania and Portugal. The United States had long relied on its geographic isolation and powerful navy for security, and the army had received relatively little attention during the interwar years. Most American soldiers in the late 1930s were stationed at scattered posts across the country, performing routine garrison duties rather than preparing for modern mechanized warfare. Tanks were limited in number, armored doctrine was still evolving. Large-scale field exercises were rare. Compared to the massive armies that Germany and the Soviet Union were building in Europe, the American army appeared almost insignificant. German officers were also influenced by their memories of the First World War. In 1917 and 1918, American troops had entered the conflict on the Western Front in large numbers. They had fought bravely, but many German veterans remembered them as enthusiastic yet tactically inexperienced soldiers who relied heavily on Allied support and superior numbers. These memories reinforced the belief that American soldiers possessed courage, but lacked the refined tactical knowledge of European armies that had spent decades studying modern warfare. Ideology played an important role as well. Nazi racial theories portrayed the United States as a weak and divided society composed of many ethnic groups. Adolf Hitler himself frequently dismissed the United States as a mongrel nation, incapable of producing a disciplined army comparable to those of Europe. These views filtered through German military culture, reinforcing the assumption that American forces would be slow to mobilize and slow to learn the brutal realities of modern war. Even as the United States began expanding its military after 1940, German planners believed it would take years for the country to build an effective army capable of challenging the Wehrmacht. When American troops finally arrived in North Africa in late 1942, during Operation Torch, many German officers viewed them with curiosity but little fear. The United States was seen as an industrial giant, certainly capable of producing enormous quantities of equipment, but the quality of its soldiers and commanders remained an open question. That question would soon be answered in dramatic fashion. By early 1943, the North African campaign had reached a critical phase. After the Allied landings in Morocco and Algeria during Operation Torch, American and British forces began pushing east toward Tunisia, hoping to trap German and Italian forces between themselves and the advancing British Eighth Army under General Bernard Montgomery. But the Axis forces in Tunisia were far from defeated. German commanders had rushed reinforcements across the Mediterranean, creating a powerful defensive line anchored by experienced panzer divisions. Among these commanders was Erwin Rommel, whose Afrika Korps had already earned a formidable reputation across the deserts of Libya and Egypt. The American forces entering Tunisia were new to combat. Many units had never faced enemy fire before. Their training had been conducted largely in the United States, where exercises often lacked the realism and pressure of real battlefield conditions. Commanding the American Second Corps was Major General Lloyd Fredendall. Fredendall's leadership style quickly became controversial. Rather than placing his headquarters near the front lines, he established it in a massive bunker nearly 70 miles behind the battlefield. From this distant position, he attempted to command his forces using confusing orders and complicated defensive plans. American units were spread thinly across a wide front, occupying isolated defensive positions in mountainous terrain. The arrangement made coordination difficult and left large gaps between units. German commanders quickly noticed these weaknesses. On February 14, 1943, Rommel launched a bold offensive designed to exploit the American positions. German armored units advanced through the passes of the Atlas Mountains, concentrating their forces against isolated American units that lacked sufficient support. The attack struck with devastating effect. Panzer divisions smashed through American defensive lines, using speed and coordinated firepower to overwhelm positions one by one. Tanks appeared suddenly on narrow roads and ridges, catching many American soldiers by surprise. Communications broke down. Units lost contact with their neighbors. Orders became confused or contradictory. As German forces pushed through Kasserine Pass, the situation rapidly descended into chaos. American tanks attempted to resist but were often outmaneuvered by experienced German crews. Artillery units struggled to reposition under pressure. Supply convoys clogged the narrow roads as retreating units attempted to escape the advancing panzers. Some American soldiers fought stubbornly, but many others had never experienced such an intense armored assault. Without clear leadership or coordinated defenses, their positions became increasingly untenable. German troops captured large quantities of American equipment, including tanks, trucks, and artillery pieces that had been abandoned during the retreat. Over the course of several days, American forces suffered roughly 6,500 casualties. Thousands of soldiers were captured. For the United States Army in Europe, it was the worst defeat of the war. To German observers, the battle seemed to confirm everything they had believed about American military weakness. Reports from the front described American soldiers retreating rapidly under pressure and abandoning large quantities of equipment. Yet, the battle also had another effect, one that German commanders did not fully anticipate. For the American High Command, Kasserine Pass was a shock. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, who served as the overall Allied commander in North Africa, recognized immediately that serious problems existed within the American command structure. Reports from the battlefield described confusion, poor coordination, and ineffective leadership. Eisenhower understood that the defeat could not simply be blamed on inexperienced troops. The deeper issue lay in the organization and leadership of the American forces. One of the most important decisions he made was to remove Lloyd Fredendall from command. In his place, Eisenhower selected a commander with a dramatically different personality and leadership style, Lieutenant General George S. Patton. Patton was already known throughout the American Army as a fierce and uncompromising leader, A veteran of the First World War and an early advocate of armored warfare, he believed deeply in aggressive action and strict discipline. Where Fredendall had commanded from distant bunkers, Patton insisted on visiting the front lines personally. Where Fredendall had tolerated confusion and disorganization, Patton demanded absolute clarity in orders and immediate obedience. When Patton arrived to take command of the Second Corps in March 1943, he began implementing sweeping changes almost immediately. Uniform standards were enforced rigorously. Soldiers were required to maintain proper appearance, even in combat zones. Patrols were intensified. Training exercises became more demanding. To some soldiers, Patton's methods seemed harsh and theatrical. He carried ivory-handled pistols and often delivered fiery speeches emphasizing aggression and courage. But beneath the theatrical image lay a serious purpose. Patton believed that discipline and confidence were essential for soldiers facing experienced German forces. The American army, he argued, had to overcome its early mistakes quickly if it hoped to survive in modern warfare. Training was intensified dramatically. Units practiced coordinated attacks involving tanks, infantry, and artillery working together. Officers were instructed to act decisively, rather than waiting for orders from higher headquarters. The psychological transformation of the soldiers was just as important as the tactical changes. Many of the same men who had retreated through Kasserine Pass were now preparing to face German forces again, but under very different conditions. The opportunity came sooner than expected. In March 1943, German forces launched another offensive near a location called Guettar. German commanders expected the attack to produce results similar to those at Kasserine. The American forces in the area were still relatively new, and the terrain seemed favorable for armored operations. But this time the Americans were ready. American engineers had laid extensive minefields across likely avenues of approach. Anti-tank guns were carefully positioned to cover open ground. Artillery units had pre-registered their firing coordinates, allowing them to respond quickly to advancing enemy forces. When German tanks from the 10th Panzer Division advanced toward American positions, they encountered a very different battlefield than the one they had seen only weeks earlier. Minefields disrupted the initial assault. Anti-tank guns opened fire as German vehicles attempted to maneuver through the obstacles. American artillery batteries began delivering heavy bombardments onto the advancing columns. The result was devastating. Dozens of German tanks were destroyed or disabled during the attack. German infantry attempting to support the armored assault were pinned down by artillery and machine gun fire. For the first time in North Africa, American forces had successfully repelled a major German armored attack. The victory at Guettar was not simply a tactical success. It marked an important turning point in the psychological balance between the two armies. German soldiers who had expected another easy breakthrough instead encountered determined resistance and effective coordination between American units. The battle demonstrated that the US Army was capable of learning quickly from its mistakes. The North African campaign soon entered its final phase. By the spring of 1943, Allied forces from the west and east were gradually compressing the remaining Axis armies into a shrinking pocket around Tunisia. American, British, and French forces advanced steadily despite stubborn resistance from German and Italian troops. Supply lines for the Axis armies became increasingly strained as Allied air and naval forces disrupted transportation across the Mediterranean. In May 1943, the campaign reached its dramatic conclusion. Facing overwhelming Allied forces and dwindling supplies, the Axis commanders in Tunisia surrendered. Approximately 275,000 German and Italian soldiers were taken prisoner. The scale of the surrender rivaled the German defeat at Stalingrad earlier that year. For the American army, the victory in Tunisia represented a remarkable recovery from the humiliation of Kasserine Pass only months earlier. Yet the lessons of the North African campaign extended far beyond individual battles. During this period, the United States military began developing a distinctive system of warfare that would define its operations throughout the rest of the conflict. Unlike the German military tradition, which often emphasized individual battlefield brilliance and decentralized initiative, the American approach increasingly focused on coordination between different elements of military power. Artillery, infantry, armor, air power, and logistics were integrated into a unified operational system designed to maximize firepower and mobility. One of the key advantages of American forces was their high level of motorization. While many German divisions still relied heavily on horses to transport supplies and artillery, American units were equipped with thousands of trucks and vehicles. This allowed them to move rapidly across large distances and maintain reliable supply lines even during fast-moving operations. Communication technology also played a crucial role. American units were equipped with large numbers of radios, allowing commanders to coordinate artillery strikes, air support, and troop movements with unprecedented speed. This system did not rely solely on individual heroism. Instead, it multiplied the effectiveness of each soldier by surrounding him with a powerful network of support. Nowhere was this more evident than in the American artillery system. During the war, the US Army developed an innovative method of coordinating artillery fire known as the Fire Direction Center. Rather than having individual artillery batteries operate independently, the Fire Direction Center centralized the process of calculating firing solutions and coordinating multiple batteries simultaneously. A forward observer at the front lines could request artillery support by radio. Within moments, multiple batteries located miles away could begin firing at the same target with carefully calculated timing. One of the most devastating techniques developed under this system was known as time on target. By adjusting the firing times of different artillery batteries, commanders could ensure that shells from dozens of guns arrived at the target area simultaneously. For enemy soldiers on the receiving end, the effect was terrifying. Instead of hearing the gradual approach of incoming artillery rounds, entire barrages would explode across the battlefield without warning. German soldiers on the Western Front frequently described American artillery as the most feared weapon they encountered. Even experienced Wehrmacht veterans who had fought on the Eastern Front often remarked on the speed and intensity of American artillery fire. The effectiveness of this system would become especially important during the next major phase of the war in Europe. In June 1944, Allied forces launched one of the largest amphibious invasions in history along the coast of Normandy. American, British, and Canadian troops stormed the beaches of northern France, establishing a foothold that would eventually lead to the liberation of Western Europe. But the battles that followed the landings proved far more difficult than many planners had expected. The countryside of Normandy was dominated by a unique landscape known as the bocage. Fields were separated by thick hedgerows growing atop earthen embankments that had been built over centuries of farming. These hedgerows created natural walls several feet high, reinforced by dense vegetation and tree roots. For defending German forces, the bocage provided ideal defensive positions. Machine gun teams could hide behind the hedgerows, firing at advancing troops while remaining protected from return fire. Tanks attempting to cross the hedgerows often exposed their vulnerable undersides or stalled while climbing the embankments. American forces advancing inland from the beaches quickly discovered that the terrain severely limited their mobility. Progress slowed to a crawl. Infantry units suffered heavy casualties while attempting to clear field after field of well-hidden German defenders. Tanks struggled to support the infantry effectively in such restrictive terrain. For weeks, the fighting in Normandy became a brutal war of attrition. German commanders hoped that the bocage landscape might neutralize the Americans' advantages in artillery and air power, allowing them to hold the line long enough to stabilize the front. But once again, the American military system proved remarkably adaptable. One of the most famous innovations emerged from the ingenuity of a single soldier. Sergeant Curtis Cullen of the US 2nd Armored Division began experimenting with ways to help tanks break through the hedgerows. Using steel beams salvaged from German beach obstacles, he constructed a series of metal prongs that could be welded to the front of American tanks. These devices allowed tanks to punch directly through the hedgerows instead of attempting to climb over them. The invention was simple but extremely effective. Once demonstrated, the hedgerow cutters were rapidly adopted across American armored units throughout Normandy. This innovation reflected an important aspect of American military culture during the war: the willingness to adopt practical solutions from soldiers at every level of the organization. Ideas developed by frontline troops could quickly spread across entire divisions. By late July 1944, the stage was set for a major breakthrough. The operation designed to shatter the German defenses in Normandy was known as Operation Cobra. On July 25th, hundreds of Allied bombers roared overhead, dropping massive quantities of explosives onto a narrow section of the German front line. The bombardment targeted several German divisions, including the elite Panzer Lehr division. The bombing was devastating. Entire sections of the German defensive line were obliterated. Vehicles were destroyed, communications collapsed. When American ground forces advanced following the bombing, they encountered disorganized and weakened resistance. The German line began to crumble. Within days, American armored divisions surged through the gap, racing across the French countryside. What followed was one of the most dramatic operational breakthroughs of the war in Western Europe. General George S. Patton's Third Army spearheaded the advance. Patton's forces moved with extraordinary speed, exploiting the collapse of German defenses and driving deep into France. Armored columns bypassed strongpoints, cutting off supply routes and encircling enemy formations. German commanders struggled desperately to stabilize the situation. But the American advance had become too fast and too widespread. The climax came in August 1944 with the formation of the Falaise Pocket. Allied forces closed in from multiple directions, trapping large portions of the German 7th Army inside a shrinking pocket of territory. The fighting within the pocket was chaotic and brutal. German units attempted desperate breakouts, while Allied aircraft and artillery bombarded the trapped forces. By the time the pocket finally collapsed, tens of thousands of German soldiers had been killed or captured. Much of Germany's remaining armored strength in France had been destroyed. For many German officers, the events in Normandy forced a profound reassessment of their earlier views about the American military. The army that had once collapsed at Kasserine Pass had now executed one of the most successful operational breakthroughs of the war. Yet the final and most dramatic test of the American army was still to come. In December 1944, Adolf Hitler launched a massive surprise offensive through the Ardennes forest of Belgium and Luxembourg. The operation became known as the Battle of the Bulge. Hitler's plan was bold and desperate. German armored divisions would smash through the Allied front lines, capture the port of Antwerp, and split the Allied armies in Western Europe. German planners hoped that the sudden attack would cause American forces to collapse just as they had during the early days at Kasserine Pass. But the situation in 1944 was very different from that in 1943. American units defending the Ardennes were experienced veterans who had fought across France and Belgium. Their commanders understood German tactics far better than they had 2 years earlier. As German forces advanced through the snowy forests, they encountered stubborn resistance at key locations. At Lanzerath Ridge, a small group of American soldiers held off a much larger German force for an entire day, disrupting the timetable of the offensive. At Elsenborn Ridge, American infantry and artillery units formed a defensive line that proved nearly impossible for German forces to break. One of the most famous episodes occurred in the town of Bastogne. Surrounded by German forces and cut off from supplies, the American 101st Airborne Division refused to surrender despite heavy bombardment and freezing winter conditions. Their resistance became a symbol of the determination that now characterized the American army. Meanwhile, General Patton executed one of the most remarkable maneuvers of the war, pivoting his Third Army. Northward in the middle of winter, Patton launched a rapid counter-offensive through difficult terrain to relieve the surrounded defenders of Bastogne. Within days, his armored columns broke through the German lines and reopened the supply route to the city. The Battle of the Bulge ultimately exhausted Germany's remaining strategic reserves. Many of the panzer divisions that had spearheaded the offensive were destroyed or crippled. For German soldiers fighting in the West, the experience of facing American forces had changed dramatically since the early days of the war. After the conflict ended, numerous German officers reflected on their encounters with the American army. Interestingly, many did not express fear of individual American soldiers in the traditional sense. Instead, they described a deeper concern about the overall American system of warfare. The combination of powerful artillery, constant air support, reliable logistics, and overwhelming industrial production created a battlefield environment that was extremely difficult to overcome. German units could win small tactical victories, but they often found themselves facing an endless flow of American reinforcements and equipment. American artillery could deliver massive firepower within minutes. Aircraft dominated the skies during daylight hours. Fuel, ammunition, and replacement vehicles arrived continuously from an industrial base that dwarfed anything Germany could produce. In this system, the individual American soldier became part of something much larger. A vast military machine capable of adapting, learning, and applying overwhelming force across the battlefield. In February 1943, at Kasserine Pass, the United States Army appeared to confirm the doubts of its enemies. German Panzer divisions smashed through inexperienced American defenses. Units retreated in confusion. Equipment was abandoned across the desert. To German commanders like Erwin Rommel, the battle seemed to prove that the American army was tactically inferior and poorly prepared for modern war. Yet less than 2 years later, those same soldiers would face American forces in the frozen forests of the Ardennes during the Battle of the Bulge. And this time, the outcome was very different. American troops held their ground against some of Germany's most elite panzer divisions. They coordinated artillery and air power with devastating efficiency. They maneuvered rapidly across the battlefield and counterattacked with overwhelming force. The transformation between those two moments was one of the most remarkable military evolutions of the Second World War. It was not simply a story about bravery. American soldiers had always possessed courage. What changed was the system around them. The United States Army learned quickly from failure. Leaders who proved ineffective were replaced. Training became more realistic and demanding. New tactics were tested and refined under real combat conditions. At the same time, the immense industrial power of the United States created a logistical and technological foundation that allowed American forces to fight a new kind of war. Artillery coordination, motorized logistics, air-ground cooperation, and rapid communication transformed how battles were fought. German officers who had once dismissed American troops were forced to acknowledge this change. In post-war interrogations and memoirs, many admitted that the American military had become one of the most formidable opponents they faced during the war. But behind the statistics and the strategies were ordinary soldiers. Young men who entered the war inexperienced and uncertain. Many of them first encountered the brutal reality of combat in places like Kasserine Pass. Yet through hard lessons, relentless training, and the leadership of commanders determined to adapt, those same soldiers became veterans of one of the most powerful military machines in history. Their journey reflected something deeper about the nature of war itself. Armies that refuse to learn from defeat rarely survive. But those that adapt quickly can transform weakness into strength. And in the case of the United States Army during World War II, that transformation helped change the course of history. So here's a question worth thinking about. If the disaster at Kasserine Pass had never happened, would the American Army have learned the lessons that eventually helped defeat Nazi Germany? Let me know what you think in the comments below. If you enjoyed this deep dive into World War II history, be sure to like the video. It really helps the channel. And if you want to see more historical documentaries like this one, don't forget to subscribe and enable notifications so you never miss a new upload. Thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next video.